Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. Marking his second year in office, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol reaffirmed his commitment to strengthening Korea's alliance with the U.S. But uncertainties loom over Washington's foreign policy course after the presidential election. Today we discuss how South Korea can best chart its course forward.
워싱턴 선언으로 한미 동맹을 핵 기반의 안보 동맹으로 업그레이드하고 한미 글로벌 포괄 전략 동맹을 가동해오고 있습니다.
昨年以来、岸田総理とユン大統領のリーダーシップのもと、首脳間のシャトル外交が再開されるとともに、
In the studio with me, Mr. Frederick Fleitz, Vice Chair of the Center for American Security at the America First Policy Institute. Mr. Fleitz was the National Security Council Chief of Staff during the Trump administration. Mr. Fleitz was also a CIA intelligence analyst covering WMD proliferation. Also joining us, Ambassador James Zumwalt, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C. Ambassador Zumwalt was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs and was also Ambassador to the Republic of Senegal and the Republic of Guinea-Bissau. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Fleitz, President Yoon Suk-yeol is entering his third year in office, and he has prioritized value-based diplomacy with the United States and Japan. What do you think were the tangible results from his global pivotal state diplomacy?
Well, I think President Yoon was a breath of fresh air for U.S.-South Korea relations. I think he's been a decisive leader who has tried to advance South Korea's interest at times that maybe the United States was a little bit neglectful towards the region. As we've discussed before, I think the brilliant trilateral efforts between the United States, South Korea, and Japan were sparked by President Yoon because he was concerned not enough attention was being paid to regional security. He proposed bringing nuclear weapons to South Korea. That led the United States to hop to it and begin paying more attention to South Korea and to work to enhance this relationship. This was all because of President Yoon. I give him a lot of credit for that, and I believe that will continue in his next year as president.
Ambassador Zumwalt, some Koreans criticize that President Yoon is heavily focusing on U.S.-Japan relationship too much and deepening of confrontation with North Korea, China, and Russia. Do you think such criticism is justified? What are the views from Washington?
I don't believe such views are justified, and I would agree that President Yoon has done a masterful job of advancing Korea's interests in a secure and stable region. Korea has to think about its own national security, and because it faces a tremendous threat from the north, enhancing alliance relationships with the United States and enhancing a partnership with Japan is really in everyone's interest, because that's how we can deter North Korea from taking provocative steps.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Fleitz, the Yoon administration is credited with taking the U.S.-Korea relationship to the next level by signing the Washington Declaration. However, critics say that Washington Declaration is vague and only buys time, and a top candidate for potential second Trump cabinet says that the nuclear umbrella is actually very limited. And a lot of South Koreans also want to get their own nuclear weapons. Do you think the Yoon and Biden administration's blueprint for strengthening the bilateral relationship is on a smooth sailing at this point?
Look, I'm a Republican. I work for President Trump, but I give President Biden a lot of credit for the Washington Declaration and for pursuing this trilateral relationship. I believe if Trump wins the election this November, he will continue that effort and he will expand upon it. I also believe that President Yoon and President Trump will be fast friends. I expect Yoon to be quickly invited to Mar-a-Lago for a meeting, and if he hasn't been to Mar-a-Lago during the campaign, I hope he visits, because I think President Trump will want to meet him. A strong relationship between the United States and South Korea has always been a priority for President Trump. There's been some bumps in the road, but I think they've been resolved. I think the relationship is strong now. I give the Biden administration credit for, I think, maybe repairing it or getting it over some bumps in the road.
The newly out book, America First Policy, which you edited, and that book tells that in the second Trump presidency, U.S., South Korea, Japan trilateral cooperation will continue. What are the grounds for that? Because President Trump's transactional view on allies were often criticized to weaken the alliance relationship.
This new book, An America First Approach to U.S. National Security, was issued yesterday, the 9th of May. Readers want to read it. It's only in English, I'm afraid, but it does describe the importance of maintaining a strong relationship between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea, maintaining the trilateral relationship. Also, I believe that Trump will move very quickly to resume personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. I think there will be some things that Trump will want to resolve first. For example, I would recommend that he say to Kim, I'm not going to pursue personal relationship with you until you cut off or reduce your support to the war in Ukraine. These arms shipments have to end. I think there's a lot to think about. I can't speak for President Trump. In terms of transactional diplomacy, Trump believes in alliances and working closely with allies. He wants allies, however, to carry their own weight in alliances. But Trump has real concerns about NATO members not paying their fair share, especially not paying their fair share supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia.
Ambassador Zumwalt, South Korea and Japan have dramatically improved their frosty relations, but many say that their rapprochement is fragile and temporary, given that there are still remaining issues and that their relationship can plummet any time. Now, do you think if South Korea goes anti-Japan again and breaks out from the trilateral cooperation, then would that solidify U.S.'s perception that Japan is actually a closer ally to U.S. than South Korea?
Well, first of all, I don't think that's going to happen because I believe that it's in Korea's interest to further enhance relations with its partner Japan and its ally, the United States. The reason for that is fundamentally we share common values. We're democracies, we believe in rule of law, we want to see a peaceful and stable region, we want a free and open Indo-Pacific region. So we share those common values and common interests. And Korea naturally will pursue its own interests, but I think that pursuit of its own interests lead Korea to further enhance its relationship because Japan believes in the same things and wants to see the same things.
But you cannot neglect the domestic politics, and one of the top foreign policy items that could influence after the domestic policy landscape changes is relationship with Japan.
Mm-hmm. Of course, we can't ignore that there are historical issues and issues that remain unresolved between South Korea and Japan, but that doesn't prevent South Korea from working together with Japan when it is in its interest to do so. I would just point out, for example, the United States, we have territorial disputes with Canada, but that doesn't prevent us from cooperating with Canada because we have such a large array of interests in common. And so that's what I hope to see going forward between Japan and Korea's acknowledgement there are issues that need to be worked on, but at the same time that doesn't prevent working together to advance common interests.
And Ambassador Zumwalt, if South Korea becomes more engaged with China and takes an ambiguous stance on U.S.-led pressure campaign against China, do you think the U.S. perception of South Korea as being the strategic asset could change significantly?
In the United States' interest to have a strong relationship with the Republic of Korea because Korea is a consequential country that has a lot of interests. That's one reason why we were very much in favor of creating the G20 to bring voices like Korea's to the table in trying to formulate the international rules. So I am optimistic about the future of our relationship because I think it's in the United States' interest to continue our partnership with Korea, not only our security relationship, but also our efforts to enhance a free and open Indo-Pacific region. If you look back in history, in the 1960s and 1970s, Korea was a small and a poor country, and so Korea was a rule taker. Other nations would set the rules and Korea had to follow them. Now Korea has a chance, or Korea is participating as a rule maker. They're sitting at the table talking with the United States and others in order to formulate the international rules. So I think in the view of the United States, that's a positive thing because we share common values. We want voices like Korea's at the table in formulating and strengthening the international system.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Fleitz, a lot of South Koreans are nervous whether the current U.S. policy of putting an importance on alliances and the value-based diplomacy, if that's going to continue even after the presidential elections. And you did talk about how President Trump may endorse the Trilateral Cooperation, but what about other main issues like nuclear umbrella to South Korea or policy towards North Korea?
I think there's going to be some significant changes in policy towards North Korea because I believe that President Trump will revive his personal diplomacy with North Korea if they're prepared to deal. I don't think it's going to be a unilateral offer of talks without conditions. I think North Korea has a lot to answer for because of its collaboration with Russia, the Vladivostok meeting, providing all these weapons to Russia for Ukraine, talk that North Korea wants to be part of a new axis with China, Russia, and Iran. We need to send representatives to Pyongyang and work that through and say that is not in North Korea's interest. We can find a much brighter future for North Korea by cooperating with the United States and continuing the talks that were begun during the Trump administration. And we know those talks weren't completely successful. They did stop long-range missile tests until 2022. I think more would have been done if it wasn't for the pandemic. And as I said, I don't want to speak for what Mr. Trump will do, but I believe he's very eager to resume negotiations with Kim Jong-un and find ways to normalize relations at least as much as possible and reduce tensions.
In a recent Time interview, President Trump talked about the possibility of pulling U.S. forces out of South Korea. Do you think he will endorse the nuclear umbrella, the Washington Declaration?
Again, I don't want to speak for him, but my guess would be he would endorse the Washington Declaration, he will endorse the nuclear umbrella, and he will call for a much closer relationship between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. And the main reason is because Trump is extremely worried about the threat from China. And these three nations cannot be focused on any security threat in the region that's more serious than the threat from China, a much more serious threat than North Korea. I guess in South Korea, that doesn't always seem obvious, but China is an enormous existential global threat. It is an obsession with Mr. Trump and his advisors. That's why I believe he will strike a very close relationship with President Yoon.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador Zumwalt, given that there are uncertainties surrounding the U.S. presidential elections, we do not even know who will win that election too. So do you think it's prudent for South Korea to think of alternative diplomacy options?
Well, when you are a partner with a democracy, the definition of a democracy is there are changes of leadership. And the United States deals with that with our partners, Korea and Japan. We recognize that the people of Korea will choose their leader. And so our objective then is to work with all possible parties to strengthen our bilateral relationship. And I'm sure my counterparts in the Korean government are now working hard to strengthen relations with both political parties because they don't know what the outcome of the election will be either, but they want a strong relationship in the future. And that's a very prudent thing to do, just as we deal with opposition parties in Korea to make sure they understand what we believe is in our mutual interest. So we need to prepare for possible changes of government, but that's inherent in relationship between two democracies.
Right, but when preparing, if the two potential presidents, their policy is drastically different, how do you specifically prepare for that?
Well, for one thing, you want to engage with both parties and explain what you believe are in our shared interests. And so that's partly trying to influence the parties. But then also, as my colleague mentioned, developing personal relationships between leaders is very important. So should there be a change of power in the United States, or in the future there'll be a change of leadership in Korea, it's very important then for the two nations' leaders to quickly establish a personal relationship so they can work through any potential difficulties that might arise.
And Mr. Fleitz, South Korea has expanded investment in America significantly in recent years. Would that be helpful to highlight South Korea's such contribution to U.S. economy?
Well, I will tell you that when I worked for President Trump and when I sat in on foreign leaders, the first thing he would ask about investment in the United States by foreign countries. And if the trade imbalance was bad, he would read the riot act to these various officials and say, well, we have to have free and fair trade. And South Korean investment in the United States will be a big plus when President Yoon meets with President Trump. I would imagine that President Trump will have a memo in front of him on U.S.-South Korea trade before the meeting. He may go over it during the meeting. It's what he does with all leaders, so I think that'll be a good start.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Fleitz, reportedly Korea, Japan, and China will hold a summit in Seoul later this month. The Biden administration has gone to great length to strengthen the trilateral cooperation to check China. Even though there may have been some coordination with Washington in advance, don't you think this meeting is still very sensitive in the eyes of Washington?
It's sensitive, but talk is good. We have to keep dialogue even with the leaders of states that may be adversaries. And I think it's a good development. I think the Chinese government, President Xi, has his own agenda. I'm sure he would like to divide the United States from South Korea and Japan. He will make some very tempting offers to these leaders during the meeting. But it's a very savvy move by Japan and South Korea to do a meeting like this, because tensions with China have to be addressed. In the South China Sea, with Taiwan, with trade, there's big problems here, and we can't simply let them grow and grow. The late Henry Kissinger said in the last year of his life, a major criticism he has of the Biden administration is that there has been far too little dialogue between the United States and leaders of our adversaries. We have to talk to them. The dialogue will help minor situations from spinning out of control. So I'm very supportive of this meeting.
Just to add to that, there have been a string of U.S. high-level officials visiting Beijing, China, to have that dialogue. So I think the Biden administration is moving towards that end. Ambassador Zumwalt, is there any red line that Japan, South Korea, China cooperation that, if crossed, may undermine U.S. interests?
Yeah, I don't think it's appropriate to talk about a friend and saying we have a red line. And I would agree that this trilateral summit, for one thing, these are not new. This is a resumption of a pattern of trilateral summits. But I think the United States sees this as an opportunity. I'm sure our colleagues in Japan and South Korea will be addressing issues such as China's support of Russia's war in Ukraine. So it's helpful for our friends and allies to speak up and reiterate messages that we have been conveying to China as well. So I see this trilateral summit as an opportunity. I don't think China would succeed at dividing South Korea and the United States because our relationship is strong.
You say that there's no red line, but during the Moon administration, when high-level South Korean official openly said that South Korea wants to pursue economic cooperation with China and security cooperation with the United States, the State Department actually said that South Korea made its decision 70 years ago to form an alliance with the United States. State Department usually doesn't say these kind of statements. It sounded a little bit of emotional there, but how would you respond to that?
I'm confident that no one in the Yoon administration would make such a statement.
Now, Mr. Fleitz, President Trump, he may want to first have North Korea settle things with Russia military cooperation first before pursuing the high-level diplomacy you said. But what is President Trump's idea about President Putin? Many people think that President Trump have close relationship with President Putin. What is his idea about the Ukraine war?
It's a good question. In our new book, we have a very long chapter on America First, Ukraine, and Russia. And despite all the criticism of Trump by people in the media and people in the political establishment that Trump was pro-Putin, Trump took a transactional relationship with Putin, but he also took a lot of steps that Putin didn't like. He shut off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. He bombed various targets in Syria, some of which killed Russian mercenaries. And I think there'll be a tough relationship, there'll be a transactional relationship, there'll be more dialogue. Even in the depths of the Cold War, US and Soviet and US and Chinese officials were in communication.
Ambassador Zumwalt, Wendy Sherman in 2015, then Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, said in Seoul that sustainable answer to denuclearization is the unification of the Koreas. With this reunification, we will be able to ensure that there are no nuclear weapons. Do you agree that reunification of the two Koreas is the ultimate answer to the North Korean problem, including the denuclearization?
Well, I think the United States has supported the desire of the Korean people to see a reunification on the peninsula, but on peaceful terms. And the reason we're confident in making that statement is we know that the people of South Korea support a democratic form of government. They don't want to give up their rights. And so we're confident that should the two Koreas in the future work out some kind of accommodation, that would ultimately be in the United States' interest. But I think this is a long-term goal. It's not something we're going to see, I don't think, in the short term.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Fleitz, Dr. Victor Cha, the Korea chair of CSIS, emphasizes that reunification will come suddenly. And President Obama and Ambassador Sherman all mentioned the possible collapse of North Korea. The 2022 National Defense Strategy talks about ending the North Korean regime if North Korea uses nuclear weapons. And also Ambassador Zumwalt, is it safe to say there is always a plan B for North Korea?
I guess there might be a plan B for North Korea, but I'd remind you that during the Obama administration, they had a policy towards North Korea called strategic patience, because the Obama administration thought the North Korean regime was going to fall. We're now 20 years later and that hasn't happened. I don't see that regime falling anytime soon. I guess the US government has contingencies for any possibility. I think the solution to differences with North Korea is dialogue and to try to find ways to lower tensions, not talking about ways to end their regime or talking about how we hope the regime ends. That simply raises tensions. It's not something I'm going to do, and I don't think President Trump will either.
But the U.S. administrations have been talking with North Korea for 30 years, and that only buys time for North Korea to sophisticate its nuclear weapons.
There's different ways of looking at this. I think many of the discussions in the past have been ineffective, and the North Koreans have played us for fools, frankly. They have used these talks to get concessions. Trump didn't give any concessions to North Korea other than meeting with Kim Jong-un. We did get a freeze of long-range missile tests until 2022. I would like to think Trump's tough policy with North Korea led to the suspension of nuclear tests. They haven't conducted a seventh underground nuclear test yet. I hope that never happens, but you know there are indications that the North is thinking of doing that. There may be preparations for such an effort. Dialogue is necessary. Stopping the long-range missile test was a start, but much more has to be done to stop the missile program and to truly denuclearize North Korea. I think Trump made progress in that direction, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Ambassador Zumwalt, North Korea is called the land of lousy options. There's criticism towards President Trump's approach. There's criticism towards President Biden's approach. What are your recommendations?
Well, I do agree that our options are not great, but I do think that despite the failure of talks on denuclearization, we've been successful in the sense that South Korea and the United States have deterred North Korea from taking provocative action such as invasion. So there's been an element of success in that. Getting to your question about a plan B, I do think that a United States government would acknowledge that South Korea has agency. This isn't something that we determine in Washington. It's something that in partnership with our ally, we have discussions. We would see how we could assist the Republic of Korea should there ever be a collapse in the North. So it's something that I think it would be fundamental to our interests, is to acknowledge that it's really South Korea that is the main player on the peninsula, and we have to work together with them to deal with any kind of a contingency.
But military-wise, there are always very specific contingency planning, right, in all circumstances on the Korean peninsula.
No, there is a lot of contingency planning, but that's something that the United States does in partnership with our ally. It's not something the United States does in isolation.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Ambassador Zumwalt, Mr. Fleitz, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Good to be here.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.